There are moments in music history when a single song rises above time itself, echoing long after the world has moved on. Picture Detroit on a warm summer night, the air thick with soul, and a sound so smooth it could stop the city in its tracks. That sound belonged to the Floaters. They soared to the top with a style nobody had tried before, yet fate would label them with a title no artist ever wants to hear. But what really happened to the group behind the unforgettable words that once floated across the world? And why did their story fade, even when their music never did? Let's get into their story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the Floaters ever stepped onto a stage, before their voices blended into the signature sound the world would one day remember, there was Detroit. Not the Detroit of bright marquees and polished studios, but the Detroit of narrow streets, corner stores, and neighborhoods that carried both struggle and soul. In those early years, the East Side was a place where dreams had to fight for space, yet music still found its way into every hallway and open window. It was the kind of city where a young man could shape his entire identity through the rhythm he heard around him. James Mitchell grew up in that world, surrounded by family, work, and the pulse of Motown that drifted through the neighborhoods. His childhood was ordinary in many ways, but there was something in the sounds of Detroit that kept pulling him forward. While other kids spent afternoons playing ball in the streets, he was studying harmonies, listening to records, and watching performers at local clubs. Those moments planted a seed in him long before he ever thought about forming a group of his own. His younger brother, Paul Mitchell, felt that pull too, drawn to the same atmosphere of soul and possibility that filled their part of the city. A few miles away, young Larry Cunningham was growing up with the same hunger to rise. His family lived in the Sojourner Truth Housing Projects, a place where resources were thin but imagination remained rich. Music was not a luxury there, it was a lifeline. Larry soaked in every note he heard, from gospel choirs to R&B, voices drifting from neighbors' radios. Like many kids in Detroit at the time, he learned early that talent alone was not enough. You had to work, sacrifice, and believe even when nothing around you gave you a reason to. Charles Clark and Ralph Mitchell came from similar corners of the East Side. They too were shaped by the projects, by tight households where parents worked long hours, and by communities that held on to hope even when times were difficult. Nights were often quiet, but behind closed doors families prayed, laughed, and shared the small comforts that kept them moving. For Charles, singing was not just something he enjoyed, it was part of how he understood the world. Ralph found comfort in performing, using music as an escape from the pressures that surrounded him. They were regular boys living regular lives, yet each carried a spark waiting for the right moment to ignite. Detroit during those years was a crucible of creativity. Clubs were packed with local acts trying to be heard, and audiences were hungry for something new. Teenagers rehearsed on porches, in school hallways, and in community centers where volunteers believed deeply in giving kids a chance. The Mitchell brothers found themselves performing anywhere people would listen. Larry and Charles did the same, each stepping into the small stages scattered across the city. These were not glamorous venues. The lighting was dim, the crowds unpredictable, and the pay nearly non-existent. But those nights were where their confidence grew, where they learned how to command attention with nothing but a microphone and a dream. James eventually joined the Detroit Emeralds, gaining a taste of professional music and learning the discipline required to survive in the industry. He saw the demands, the pressure, and the heartbreak that could come with success. Yet he also saw the magic that happened when the right voices came together. His experience with the Emeralds quietly shaped his belief that Detroit had more to offer, that there were local talents capable of something bigger. He watched the younger generation behind him and felt a sense of responsibility to help guide them. When life brought James, Paul, Larry, Charles, and Ralph into the same orbit, something clicked. They were different in personality, different in tone, but united by the same desire to rise above the circumstances that defined their early lives. The group that would one day be known as the Floaters began informally, built through conversations in clubs, impromptu harmonies backstage, and long nights spent imagining what they could create together. Their beginnings were nothing glamorous. They rehearsed in basements and small rented rooms, tightening harmonies until every note fell exactly where it needed to. They wrote ideas in notebooks, experimented with phrasing, and pushed each other to refine their style. Detroit shaped them, but their determination shaped everything else. They believed there was space in the musical landscape for a sound that blended smooth R&B with intimate storytelling, something romantic yet grounded in the grit of their lives. Before anyone outside Michigan heard their voices, these 5 young men were simply chasing possibility. They were sons of the East Side, molded by a city that never guaranteed success but rewarded those brave enough to keep trying. The Floaters were not stars yet. They were dreamers with worn shoes, steady hearts, and a vision of music that could lift them beyond the limits of their world. And long before their record ever hit a turntable, the journey that would change their lives had already begun. In the beginning, the Floaters were not aiming for fame as much as they were searching for a sound that felt true to who they were. Detroit was full of talented groups at the time, and competition was everywhere. You could walk into almost any nightclub and hear harmonies strong enough to shake the walls. But what set these young men apart was not just their voices. It was the way they listened to each other, the way they blended their tones until it felt like a single breath rising from 5 different hearts. Their earliest shows were in small clubs where the crowd stood only a few feet away. Those close quarters pushed them to perform with intensity because every expression, every misstep, and every moment of brilliance happened right in front of people who could see it all. They learned to read a room, to hold attention even when the audience was distracted, and to deliver each note with conviction. In those early nights, their confidence grew. They were not stars, but they were becoming something solid, something undeniable. James Mitchell guided much of the group's direction during this period. His time with the Detroit Emeralds had taught him discipline, and he passed that discipline on to the others. Rehearsals were not casual. They practiced until their harmonies locked into place, until the timing of each vocal entrance felt effortless, and until their tone had a softness that wrapped around listeners in a way few groups could achieve. James believed that preparation was their only advantage in an industry that often overlooked young black artists, unless they delivered something exceptional. Their first attempts at recording were modest. They laid down early demos, hoping to capture the energy they felt on stage. These sessions were often recorded in small local studios, with equipment that had seen better days, but even those rough tapes carried something distinct. You could hear their personalities in them, the gentle romantic tone of Charles Clark, the emotional depth of Larry Cunningham, the steady warmth of Paul Mitchell, the youthful charm of Ralph Mitchell, and the seasoned leadership of James. Together, they created a feeling more than a sound, something intimate that listeners could connect with instantly. Still, the industry was unpredictable. Many record labels were hesitant, unsure of where a group like this fit into the market. The Floaters were not following trends. They were not chasing disco, funk, or hard soul dominance. They wanted to build something softer, smoother, something that let each member speak directly to the listener. That approach felt risky in a world where radio hits often demanded energy and flash. So the group continued performing, hoping that persistence would open a door. They played at local festivals, community events, and larger clubs when they could get the booking. Each show taught them something new. They adjusted harmonies, refined arrangements, and pushed their signature romantic style further, letting spoken introductions and slow builds guide the audience into their songs. Detroit crowds responded with warmth. People recognized sincerity when they heard it, and the Floaters offered nothing less. Some nights, applause filled the room long after their final note. Other nights, the response was quieter but still genuine. Every performance strengthened their belief that they were onto something meaningful. And as their reputation grew, whispers began spreading through the Detroit music community. There was a new group in town, a group that did not sound like anyone else. Record producers started paying attention. The Floaters were still years away from the breakthrough that would change their lives, but the foundation had been set. Their early steps had given them something crucial, a unique identity and the confidence to keep moving forward. The moment that changed everything for the Floaters did not arrive with fanfare or certainty. It began quietly, almost unexpectedly, when James Mitchell, Arnold Ingram, and Marvin Willis started piecing together a song that would feel unlike anything else on the radio. They were not trying to create a hit. They were searching for a feeling, something smooth, intimate, and personal enough to let each member of the group shine in his own way. The structure of the song was unusual from the start. Instead of a traditional lead vocalist, Each member would step forward and introduce himself by name, then speak his zodiac sign and the type of woman he was looking for. It was a romantic conversation disguised as a soul record, and no one knew whether audiences would embrace or reject something so different. Yet once the idea took shape, it felt true to who they were. It felt like the sound they had been chasing during those long nights in clubs and rehearsal rooms across Detroit. Recording the song was a turning point. When they stepped into the studio, the room felt charged with anticipation. The music began with a gentle rhythm that rolled like calm water. Then each voice entered with its own personality. Ralph carried a youthful charm. Charles brought warmth. Paul delivered steadiness. Larry added depth. And James anchored the entire performance with experience. They were not trying to impress anyone. They were simply being themselves, and somehow, that honesty made the recording glow. When the final mix of Float On played back over the studio speakers, there was a quiet moment where everyone in the room understood that something special had happened. Even so, no one predicted what would come next. The song was sent to ABC Records, and the label hesitated. It did not fit the typical mold of a soul hit. It was slow, personal, and built entirely around spoken introductions. Still, ABC took the chance and released it. Float On began spreading across Detroit first. Local radio stations played it late at night, where its slow groove and soft storytelling found a natural audience. Callers requested it repeatedly. Couples danced to it. DJs praised it. And slowly, the song broke past Detroit, reaching other cities, other radio stations, and eventually the national charts. Once it hit national airwaves, everything changed. Float On climbed to #1 on the US R&B chart and reached #2 on the Billboard Hot 100. In the United Kingdom, it reached #1 as well. The Floaters had created a global moment without expecting one. They were suddenly in demand, invited to perform on major stages and television shows, recognized everywhere they went. For the first time, these young men from Detroit realized they had stepped into a new world. The turning point had arrived, not with a single performance, but with a song that captured their identities perfectly. Float On was not just their breakthrough. It was the moment they understood the true power of their voices and the bond they had built together. The rise of Float On sent the Floaters into a world they had only imagined from afar. One moment they were performing in Detroit clubs, and the next they were stepping under bright stage lights in front of audiences that stretched out farther than they could see. The success of the single opened doors they never knew existed, and each opportunity pushed them deeper into the spotlight. Their sound, once shared only in intimate rooms, was suddenly echoing across arenas, theaters, and television screens. As they toured the country, the group felt the full weight of their breakthrough. Crowds greeted them with excitement, cheering as soon as they heard the first soft notes of their signature hit. The Floaters learned quickly that fame came with a different kind of energy, one that demanded endurance, grace, and a steady sense of who they were. But as the applause rolled over them night after night, they rose to the moment with confidence that came from years of preparation. Their first full album carried the same smooth, romantic tone that had made Float On stand out. The harmonies were carefully layered, the arrangements gentle enough to draw listeners in but strong enough to leave an impression. Reviews highlighted their unique style, and interviews often circled back to the distinct identity they had crafted. They were not just another soul group, they were storytellers through sound, offering listeners a feeling of closeness that few artists could match. One of the most surprising parts of their rise was the overwhelming support they received from audiences in the United Kingdom. Float On became a major hit there, and the group found themselves standing before crowds that embraced them with an almost unexpected level of enthusiasm. During performances overseas, people sang along to every line, including each member's spoken introduction. It was a reminder that music could travel farther than any of them imagined when they were boys in Detroit dreaming from the windows of housing projects. Television appearances followed, giving viewers across the country a chance to see the faces behind the voices. These appearances showcased the group's natural charm, their smooth personas, and the chemistry that had formed long before fame arrived. Each member brought something different to the stage, and together, they created a recognizable presence that audiences connected with instantly. For a time, they were everywhere, and the momentum seemed unstoppable. Behind the scenes, The group continued to rehearse with the same seriousness they had in their early days. James insisted on discipline, reminding everyone that success demanded the same consistency and humility they had shown before their breakthrough. The Floaters took this to heart, guarding their music carefully and refusing to let the pressure of success overshadow the bond they had formed. Their tours blended long nights, bright lights, and a sense of awe that stayed with them. The world was listening, and for the first time, they felt the full recognition of their talent. The Floaters were living the dream they had carried since childhood, performing for thousands, hearing their names announced with pride, and watching audiences respond with genuine emotion. For a brief but powerful moment, they stood at the height of their era, embraced by listeners who felt every note they sang. The triumph was real, undeniable, and deeply earned. Success can lift a group into the spotlight, but it can also place them in a position where every flaw becomes impossible to ignore. For the Floaters, the years following their breakthrough were marked by challenges that slowly pulled at the edges of everything they had built. The first major blow came when ABC Records, the label that released their hit, was sold. With that sale, the team that believed in them changed overnight. Their second album arrived without the support needed to carry its momentum, and for a group still finding its footing in the industry, that loss was devastating. Inside the group, pressure began to surface. Touring had been thrilling, but it also placed strains on friendships and routine. Each member had his own hopes, his own ideas about what the Floaters should become next. And without a stable label guiding them, those differences became harder to manage. What was once a unified dream began to feel like several dreams competing for space. The sound that once felt revolutionary now faced the challenge of shifting musical trends. The industry was moving quickly, with new styles emerging and radio stations changing their priorities. The Floaters were caught in the middle, not quite fitting into the new wave of soul and not fully supported by their label. It created a sense of uncertainty that quietly followed them everywhere they went. Tension grew as plans for their next projects became unclear. Rehearsals were still happening, but the energy had changed. Sometimes the room felt heavy, as if everyone was waiting for a solution that never arrived. Arguments surfaced, not out of anger, but out of frustration and fear. These men had come from the same streets, the same neighborhood struggles, and had built something extraordinary together. But now they were searching for answers in a world that no longer felt predictable. One of the most painful challenges came when disagreements about the group's direction intensified. Decisions about music, image, and leadership created divides. Members began questioning their roles and their future together. The addition of a local female singer, Shu Ga, on later recordings only deepened the internal tension. While her talent was undeniable, her presence became a symbol of change many were not ready for. Financial pressure added another layer to the crisis. Success from Float On had brought earnings, but sustaining a career required consistent support from both fans and the label. As sales decreased and opportunities slowed, worry began to overshadow creativity. Late-night conversations that once revolved around ideas and possibilities now centered on doubts and unanswered questions. And yet, through all these difficulties, the members of the Floaters continued to carry themselves with the quiet strength shaped by their Detroit upbringing. They showed up to rehearsals, pushed through recording sessions, and tried to hold the group together even as circumstances around them fell apart. But beneath that determination was a growing sense of exhaustion, a feeling that they were fighting forces far bigger than themselves. The crisis did not arrive suddenly. It grew slowly, like a shadow stretching across their path, and by the time they recognized how deep the problems had become, the foundation of their unity was already starting to crack. When cracks finally began to show within the Floaters, they did not appear with chaos or drama. Instead, they emerged quietly, the way small fractures spread through glass long before it shatters. Larry Cunningham and Paul Mitchell were the first to feel the weight of the group's struggles pressing too heavily against their own lives. Their departures were not acts of anger. They were decisions made after long nights of reflection, moments where each man realized that staying might cause more pain than leaving. But even so, when Larry and Paul stepped away, the loss was felt immediately. It was as if two familiar voices had gone silent in a song that had always relied on every part being present. The Floaters continued, determined to keep moving forward despite the missing pieces. They pushed themselves back into the studio, trying to recapture the emotion that once flowed so easily. Bringing in Shuga, a talented local singer, offered a new dynamic and a fresh spark, but it also highlighted how delicate the group's balance had always been. Her presence was meant to support them, yet it deepened the realization that the original harmony between the founding members could not be recreated by simply filling a space. Something had been lost that no new arrangement could fully replace. Audiences sensed the shift long before the industry acknowledged it. Concertgoers still admired the group, still respected their artistry, but the excitement that once greeted them had softened. There were nights when the applause felt thinner, when the cheers that used to shake the room now seemed gentler, almost reflective. People remembered Float On. They remembered the magic of hearing their voices glide through the air. But nostalgia alone was not enough to sustain the momentum that the Floaters had enjoyed during their peak. Promoters grew cautious. Radio stations began easing back on new releases. Reviews in newspapers were polite but noticeably restrained. The group was caught between the memory of what they had been and the uncertainty of what they were becoming. That tension made every performance feel heavier, and every rehearsal feel like a quiet attempt to prove they still had something to offer. Legal issues soon joined the mounting challenges. Disputes over the rights to the name the Floaters turned already tense relationships into fragile ones. The courtroom, with its cold language and rigid formality, felt miles away from the warm harmonies that once defined their bond. Each legal document, each argument over ownership, served as a reminder of how far the group had drifted from their beginnings in Detroit's small clubs. Those battles cut deeper than most people ever knew, not because of money or branding, but because the name represented everything they had survived together. By the time the group eventually stepped away from the spotlight, exhaustion had replaced the excitement that once pushed them forward. The separation was not sudden. It was a gradual letting go, a quiet surrender to forces they could no longer fight. The Floaters walked away with dignity, each carrying his own memories of the rise they shared and the struggles they endured. They had lived through the thrill of global recognition and the ache of watching it fade. Some returned to the roots that had shaped them, seeking comfort in church music or small community performances. Others found new careers behind the scenes, using their experience to guide younger artists. Though they no longer stood together under the same spotlight, each man carried the imprint of their shared history. And as the years passed, the silence left behind by their absence grew even more noticeable. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence that follows when something meaningful ends. It was a reminder that even the most powerful harmonies can be interrupted, and that the world does not always hold on to artists the way those artists held on to their dreams. The Floaters had once filled rooms with sound. Now, in the aftermath of their decline, they found themselves facing a far quieter truth. When the world stops listening, even the brightest voices can fade into the background. Yet beneath that silence was a lingering echo, proof that what they created had mattered, even if the industry did not always show it. Long after the applause faded and the spotlight moved on, something remarkable began to happen with the legacy of the Floaters. It did not arrive with headlines or celebrations. Instead, it grew quietly, person by person, memory by memory, in the hearts of listeners who never forgot the feeling their music once brought into a room. While the industry lived fast and often forgot even faster, everyday people held on to the sound of Float On with a loyalty that stretched far beyond anything the group had experienced during their most visible years. One of the most meaningful aspects of their legacy lies in how deeply their music connected with listeners across generations. Float On was not simply a hit record. It was an experience, a gentle conversation wrapped in harmony, offering something intimate in a world that often demanded noise and speed. The way each member introduced himself, the calm confidence in their delivery, and the soft instrumental arrangement created a moment of stillness that listeners cherished. That quality made the song timeless. Even as musical trends shifted, Float On remained a symbol of a specific kind of soul music, one built not on flash or volume, but on emotion and sincerity. Artists from later decades would point to the song as an early example of what would grow into the Quiet Storm movement, a style defined by slow grooves, romantic tones, and storytelling vocals that invited listeners to lean in closely. Groups and producers who emerged in later years spoke openly about drawing inspiration from the Floaters. Some sampled their melodies, others borrowed from their vocal style, and many simply acknowledged the way the group had carved a place for smoother, more conversational forms of R&B. Their success proved that subtlety could be powerful, that gentleness could be memorable, and that soul music had space for intimacy. In the United Kingdom, the legacy of the Floaters took on a life of its own. British audiences had embraced Float On with rare enthusiasm during its original release, and that affection never faded. Decades after its debut, radio hosts continued to play it during late-night programming, and listeners described how hearing it brought back memories of youth, summer nights, and moments of innocence. For many in the UK, the song became more than a chart topper. It became a cultural marker, a reminder of a specific time when soul music from America carried a warm, emotional sincerity that resonated deeply with British listeners. Their influence also extended into film and television. Directors used Float On to anchor nostalgic scenes or underscore romantic moments, recognizing its ability to evoke mood instantly. When the opening chords played, audiences knew exactly what kind of atmosphere the scene was aiming for. The song became shorthand for tenderness, for sweetness, for genuine emotion. It reminded viewers of an era when love songs were direct, honest, and unafraid to speak from the heart. Through these placements, the music of the Floaters reached younger generations who had not been born during the group's rise, and many of those young listeners, upon discovering the song, went searching for more. In that way, their legacy quietly rebuilt itself, carried by curiosity and the timelessness of their sound. Another aspect of their legacy came from how people in Detroit remembered them. For the city, the Floaters were not just artists with a fleeting hit. They were sons of the East Side, young men who had risen from neighborhoods where opportunities were limited and dreams were often tested. Detroit has always been a place where music is more than entertainment. It is identity, pride, and survival. The Floaters embodied that spirit. Local DJs continued to honor them. Community organizations referenced their journey as an example of what dedication could produce, and older fans recalled seeing them in small clubs long before fame arrived. When the group reunited years after their split, performing as the Floaters Orchestra, that legacy became something they could finally feel firsthand. Audiences who had grown older right alongside them came out to the shows. They brought their families, their memories, and their gratitude. These performances were not about chasing chart success. They were about reconnecting with the people who had loved them from the beginning. In those rooms, filled with warmth and nostalgia, the members of the Floaters rediscovered the magic that first brought them together. The applause may have been smaller, but it was richer, carried by sincerity rather than spectacle. The release of The Way We Were, their limited edition EP, added another layer to their legacy. It served as both a musical offering and a reflection on the past, allowing fans to hear how their voices had matured over time. There was a depth in their later performances, a sense of life lived, of lessons learned, of resilience earned the hard way. The EP reminded listeners that their talent had never disappeared. It had only evolved, shaped by years of experience and the quiet wisdom that comes with surviving both triumphs and hardships. The personal journeys of the members also became part of the group's lasting impact. Charles Clarke's move into gospel music connected him to a tradition that had always been foundational to soul. His work in that world touched congregations and communities, showing that the spirit of his voice extended far beyond the commercial music industry. Paul Mitchell's transition into producing allowed him to guide other Detroit artists, helping them navigate challenges he knew all too well. His influence behind the scenes strengthened the city's musical heritage, preserving the sound and values that shaped him. Though time passed and circumstances changed, each member continued carrying a piece of the Floaters' legacy with him. Fans often spoke about the impact of Larry Cunningham's voice, describing it as one of the defining sounds of their youth. His passing left a deep ache in the hearts of those who had grown up hearing him speak his iconic lines. When Paul Mitchell passed as well, tributes poured in from people who had never forgotten their contributions. These losses reminded the world just how much the Floaters had meant to those who lived through the era of their rise. And still, their legacy persisted. New listeners discovered Float On through online platforms, through playlists built around classic soul, and through recommendations passed down from parents and grandparents. Every time a young person pressed play and heard the gentle roll of that opening melody, the Floaters found new life. Their music continued floating forward, bridging decades and connecting strangers who shared nothing in common except a desire for something heartfelt. In the end, the legacy of the Floaters was never defined by charts, sales, or awards. It lived in the memories they shaped, in the genre they influenced, and in the quiet corners of the world where their music still plays. Their story became a reminder that some art does not shine brightest during its moment of release. Some art grows with time, deepening in value as generations rediscover it. The Floaters may not have stayed at the top of the industry, but they built something far more enduring, a sound that still brings comfort, joy, and nostalgia to anyone willing to listen. Float On became more than a song. It became a legacy, one carried not by headlines, but by the hearts of people who never let it go. As time moved forward, the world began to look back on the Floaters with a different kind of appreciation. Their story, once overshadowed by industry labels and shifting musical trends, slowly gained clarity as listeners and historians revisited the era they helped shape. What had once been dismissed as a one-hit moment now revealed itself as something deeper, something rooted in authenticity and cultural resonance. People started to recognize that the group's impact stretched far beyond a single chart-topping track. In the United States, this reflection emerged gradually. Radio hosts who had once played Float On during its peak began sharing personal stories about the song and the memories tied to it. Fans called in to describe where they were the first time they heard it, how it played at school dances, block parties, weddings, and quiet late-night drives. Younger listeners who discovered the track through family members spoke about how its softness made them stop and listen in a way few songs ever did. In these conversations, Float On was no longer just a hit. It was a part of American memory, a thread woven into moments of everyday life. Music scholars also began re-examining the Floaters' place in soul history. They pointed out the uniqueness of their approach, the bravery behind releasing a song that broke so many structural rules, and the tenderness of their vocal style. Discussions emerged about how they contributed to the evolution of slow jam culture, how their spoken introductions created an entirely new way of storytelling within R&B, and how their presence reflected the emotional honesty of Detroit's musical tradition. What had once been overlooked now became worthy of study. Their rediscovery extended into international reflections as well. In the United Kingdom, where Float On had reached extraordinary heights, the song continued to hold a special place in cultural nostalgia. British radio programs dedicated entire segments to classic soul, and the Floaters often appeared on those playlists. Commentators described them as part of the soundtrack of a generation, a group whose sound could instantly transport listeners back to warm nights, first loves, and records spinning on turntables in small flats across the country. Even after decades, the affection in those reflections remained sincere and deeply personal. Tributes grew louder following the passing of Larry Cunningham and later Paul Mitchell. Their deaths brought a wave of remembrance from fans and fellow musicians who wanted to honor the voices that had shaped their youth. Social media platforms filled with clips of performances, photos from early tours, and messages from people who said the group's music had helped them through heartbreak, loneliness, or difficult seasons in life. These tributes were not driven by sensationalism. They were quiet, heartfelt acknowledgments of artists who had left a meaningful imprint on the world. In Detroit, the reflections held an even deeper emotional weight. The city knew their history, their struggles, and their roots. Local journalists wrote about the Floaters with pride, emphasizing how their rise from the Sojourner Truth Housing projects proved that greatness could emerge from even the most overlooked corners of the city. Community centers shared their music during heritage events, and older residents passed down stories of seeing them perform long before fame touched their names. To Detroit, they were not simply musicians, they were part of the city's soul. The legacy of the Floaters found renewed life through these reflections. Their music continued playing in homes, in radio stations, in films, and on digital platforms. New generations discovered them not as a novelty from the past, but as artists who spoke directly to the heart. And with each new listener, their story quietly expanded. In the end, the world came to understand something the members of the Floaters may not have fully realized during their early struggles. They had created something that endured, something that resonated far beyond the peak of their fame. Their story became a reminder that even when an artist is overlooked, even when the industry moves on, the impact of their work can outlast everything. For the Floaters, reflection was not about rewriting history. It was about finally being seen for what they truly were. A group whose music refused to fade, carried forward by the people who felt it deeply and never let it go. As we reach the end of this story, it feels right to return to the image we began with. A quiet Detroit evening and a song that drifted through the city like a warm breeze. The Floaters came from those streets, carrying dreams shaped by small rooms, tight harmonies, and the belief that their voices could lift them into a world far beyond what they knew. For a moment, they achieved exactly that, and for many listeners, that moment never faded. Float On was more than a hit. It was a gentle reminder that music does not need noise or spectacle to leave a mark. The Floaters offered softness in a world that often demanded power, and honesty in an industry that sometimes forgot the people behind the sound. Their harmonies revealed who they were long before fame tested them. And even when the spotlight moved on, the emotional truth of their music continued living in the memories of anyone who heard it during a meaningful time in their life. Today, their story stands as a reminder of how fragile and precious success can be. The Floaters may not have stayed at the center of the music world, but they created something that carried a quiet permanence. Their voices, shaped by grit and grace, still float forward from generation to generation. So now, as we close this chapter, one question remains. Do you think the Floaters ever received the recognition they truly deserved? If their journey moved you, leave a message for them in the comments. And if you want to help keep the memories of artists like them alive, subscribe to the channel. Some stories fade with time, but together, we can make sure this one continues to float on.